For decades, the settlement project in the occupied West Bank has reshaped both the geography and the politics of the territory. Now, Israel appears set to expand that project further. The body responsible for governing the occupied territory has announced plans to advance nearly 2,000 new housing units. More than 1,500 of those are at the earliest stage, what is known as deposit status, the first step before formal approval and construction. Since the start of this year alone, Israel has advanced over 28,000 housing units across the West Bank, a record pace for the government. Many of these new units are not being added to large settlement blocks, but to isolated settlements deep inside the West Bank. For example, the settlement of Sfraim has seen roughly 300 units approved this year alone, more than were built there over previous decades combined. And earlier this year, Israel approved the long-stalled E1 plan, involving more than 3,400 housing units that would extend east of occupied Jerusalem, splitting the West Bank in two and further surrounding the city with a ring of settlements. International law is clear. All Israeli settlements in occupied territory are illegal under the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits an occupying power from transferring its civilian population into the occupied land. The settlement expansions also have real consequences on the ground. As more outposts are built, more roads are required, more checkpoints are installed, and human rights groups say that these have been accompanied by rising settler violence. One organisation documented more than 750 settler attacks causing injuries or property damage in just the first 6 months of this year, a 13% increase from last year. It is estimated that there were already around 40,000 empty housing units inside existing settlements. But Palestinians say the expansion is not about housing, it is about permanently changing the map. For Palestinians, every new road and every new outpost is not simply a building, but another barrier to sovereignty. And for many in the international community, these developments are steadily closing what remains of the possibility of a two-state solution. Israel's settlement program in the West Bank has entered a phase of acceleration and normalization. According to one report, since the current government took office, roughly 48,000 housing units have been advanced in West Bank settlements, an average of roughly 17,000 units per year. What is perhaps more consequential is the method. The review process for settlement plans has been streamlined, with the weekly meeting of the Higher Planning Council and removal of certain approvals that used to act as checks. For example, approval of thousands of units in a single session has become the norm rather than the exception. The revival of the E1 plan stands out. Located east of East Jerusalem, the E1 area would connect the major settlement of Ma'ale Adumim to Jerusalem, thereby cutting off the northern and southern West Bank from each other and isolating Palestinian neighborhoods. The Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich said of the plan, the Palestinian state is being erased from the table, not with slogans, but with actions. This kind of statement illustrates the political logic behind the expansion, not simply housing growth, but entrenching sovereignty in territory sought by Palestinians for a future state. Legal and diplomatic implications under the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 49 forbids the occupying power from transferring parts of its civilian population into territory it occupies. The UN Secretary-General's own report states that Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, are inconsistent with that convention. The E1 plan and other recent approvals have drawn widespread international condemnation. For example, one overview of international reactions states that the settlement plan would mark a flagrant breach of international law and critically undermine the two-state solution. In March 2024, the UN Rights Office described the transfer of Israelis into the occupied territory as amounting to a war crime. On the ground effects, the settlement expansions do not simply add housing, they reshape geography, infrastructure and social dynamics. More settlements mean more roads, more checkpoints and more restricted movement for Palestinians. Human rights organizations report an increase in settler violence, with documented attacks on Palestinian property and persons rising significantly. For example, one documented figure, more than 750 settler attacks causing injuries or property damage in the first 6 months of 1 year, a 13% increase over the prior year, as referenced in the original transcript. Empty housing in existing settlements also plays a role. Some 40,000 units are estimated to already be unoccupied, raising the question of whether construction is about immediate accommodation or about shaping future land claims. For Palestinians, every new road or outpost is not just another building, it is another barrier to the territorial contiguity of a future state. These infrastructure and settlement facts create fragmentation, making a contiguous Palestinian polity ever harder to sustain. The broader strategic consequence of the settlement expansion is the degradation of the two-state solution model. The combination of new settlements, infrastructure linking Israeli settlement blocks, and the E1 plan, which would cut the West Bank in two, all converge toward making a viable Palestinian state more difficult to realize. As one human rights group put it, the E1 project is a fatal blow to the two-state solution. With each new settlement unit and each new road or checkpoint, the geography shifts. What may be framed as housing development becomes part of a larger policy of territorial control, a fact not lost on international observers or the Palestinians. Israeli officials are explicit about their aims. Smotrich's public remarks underscore that the expansion is meant to shift facts on the ground by building infrastructure and housing. The intention is to embed Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank. Meanwhile, Palestinians interpret the developments as part of a long-term plan to deny them statehood. One Palestinian statement described the settlement plan as a continuation of the occupation's plans to undermine the opportunity to establish the Palestinian state on its homeland. Rather than focusing solely on large, previously established settlement blocks, the current strategy includes isolated settlements deep inside the West Bank. These create fragmentation, interrupt Palestinian contiguity, and raise the cost of any future state. Because when small settlements are far-flung, they require new roads, checkpoints, and security measures. They impose a governance and mobility burden on Palestinians. In one case cited, a settlement has seen approval of some 300 housing units this year alone, more than its total over the previous decades. While that settlement's name, as given in the transcript, might be a placeholder or transliteration, the pattern is consistent with reports of rapid growth in previously marginal or small sites. The infrastructure and administrative processes are being fast-tracked. One NGO noted that the Higher Planning Council has met weekly since late 2024 to advance settlement housing projects. The acceleration of settlement activity is happening amid a broader regional and international backdrop. The government in Israel is under pressure from election cycles and internal political dynamics. Settler-aligned ministers such as Smotrich are rising in influence. The government is also acting while global attention remains preoccupied with other crises, such as the war in Gaza. Further, the approval of the E1 area in August 2025 came just before several countries were expected to recognize a Palestinian state at the United Nations. The timing suggests that the settlement policy is not simply administrative, but politically calculated to shape future diplomatic outcomes. Since 2023, Israel has advanced approximately 48,000 housing units in the West Bank under the current government, a rate of about 17,000 units per year. In 2025 alone, some NGOs report that 25,129 housing units have been advanced. The E1 plan covers about 3,400 housing units and is projected to have major geographic impact by linking Ma'ale Adumim and East Jerusalem. In the first 6 months of a year, one report shows 12,855 housing units advanced in West Bank settlements, the highest number such a group has recorded. Governments and international organisations continue to critique the settlement expansion. For example, the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary described the E1 plan as a flagrant breach of international law, warning that it would divide a future Palestinian state. Rights groups have also warned that the expansion and associated violence constitute a grave threat to peace and risk violating international humanitarian law. For instance, the UN Rights Office concluded that the settlement enterprise constituted a war crime Still, tangible sanctions or legal enforcement mechanisms remain limited, and many settlements continue to advance regardless of external pressure. For the Palestinian population, this expansion has multiple dimensions of impact: restriction of movement, new roads, separation barriers or checkpoints accompanying settlement growth, restrict access to farmland, jobs, education and health services. Loss of territorial contiguity. Each settlement act reduces the contiguous territory over which a future Palestinian state might exercise sovereignty. Psychological and political effect, the pace and scale of building send a message of permanence, undermining the idea that the West Bank remains negotiable in its entirety. Increased settler community violence, documented attacks against Palestinians, including property damage and injury, escalate frustration and insecurity among Palestinian civilians. In sum, what might appear as housing or infrastructure projects become part of a systematic process of territorial re-engineering from the perspective of many Palestinians and policy analysts. With the E1 plan now approved and with a record pace of settlement expansions underway, the geography of the West Bank is shifting in ways that may be difficult to reverse. The fragmentation of Palestinian territory, the consolidation of Israeli control, and the rapidly changing facts on the ground all point toward a scenario in which the two-state solution is increasingly challenging to salvage. From the Israeli government's vantage point, the expansion is framed as asserting sovereignty and safeguarding national security. From the Palestinian and international perspective, it is framed as entitlement-driven colonization and a structural denial of Palestinian rights. What remains uncertain is whether future diplomatic initiatives or legal actions will be able to alter this trajectory, or whether the rapid pace of settlement advancement will outpace any meaningful negotiation. In short, the ongoing settlement expansion in the occupied West Bank is not simply a question of housing numbers. It is a strategic endeavor with geopolitical, legal, humanitarian and demographic implications, and one that is reshaping the very possibility of a Palestinian state existing side by side with Israel. Every new unit, every road, every outpost contributes to a ground reality that will determine the contours of any future peace or conflict.